Thank you, Juana. Before throwing open to questions, we have a brief presentation on behalf of the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre by Maurizio Lazzala and Malena Bengstrom to talk about a new initiative of the Resource Centre.
Thank you, Paul, for inviting us to this panel. We are here just to tell you very briefly of two new online portals that we will be launching on the first quarter of next year of 2013. I'm Mauricio Lazzala, Deputy Director of Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and we are the largest online hub on everything related to business and human rights. So these two new portals, one on the working group on business and human rights and one on the guiding principles, will be the only place online that will compile everything related, all the materials related to these two mechanisms. They will include external commentaries and submissions by civil society, by companies, by business associations, by academics, also press articles and other materials. They will also highlight gaps in corporate respect for human rights despite the guiding principles, the kind of stuff that Debbie and Juana were talking about. They will also link to the legislative history and the preparatory work leading to these two mechanisms, namely all the huge amount of materials produced by Professor Ruggie when he was a special rapporteur on business and human rights. And very importantly, they will have dedicated landing pages with materials in all 6 UN languages plus Portuguese. If we are talking about capacity building, we think it's imperative to have much more accessible materials in all 6 UN languages and Portuguese at the very least. And in the future, hopefully having even more materials in all languages there. We thank the governments of the UK and Germany for their financial support of these two new portals. And now I will hand it over to my colleague Malena that will explain the tools that will be posted in these two new online portals.
So what we will have is part of the UN Guiding Principles portal will include a hub dedicated to gather tools for implementing the guiding principles. It will be directed at all sectors. So we'll have tools for companies, tools for governments, tools for NGOs and others. Everything we can find and come across, or that hopefully you will send us as well. We'll gather these materials and organize them in an as user-friendly way as we can. We'll have it by sector, by region, by type of implementation, and potentially even more categories. The hub will feature practical examples as well. So what companies, governments, and others have done in implementing the UN Guiding Principles. And we'll also have a section for feedback on the tools so that people who are using them and other independent experts can send us submissions on what they're thinking about the tools. This section will also have materials in all UN languages and Portuguese. So please come up and speak to us if you have anything to contribute to that. We'd be happy to feature any of your materials.
Just to mention to the people that don't know our website, the URL is www.business-humanrights.org. And the portals will be there online by the end of the first quarter of next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurizio and Malena. Most people in this room will know already what a wonderful portal the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre is and how much we all rely upon it. So thank you for that presentation. Friends, we've had, thank you for the speakers for being so respectful of time limits and to allow us some time, a generous time, relatively until 3:15 for discussion of this enormous question. An evenness of capacity that's been referred to across the system. The reality is, of course, that the capacity, effective capacity to exercise rights and assume responsibilities under the system and duties under the guiding principles is a precondition to their implementation. And problem areas have been identified in the presentations we've had. Let's call upon the speakers. I've got Ms. Marietta van, and apologies to your name, would you stay? As the first speaker. I'm from the civil society. Marietta.
Thank you, Professor Redmond, for giving me the floor. My name is Mariette van Huistee, and sorry for turning my back to you, but I'm going to speak in a mic. So I'm a researcher for the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations, abbreviated as SOMO. And we are based in civil society. We recognize the limited dissemination of the guiding principles within civil society, so the limited knowledge about them. And realizing that we have actually developed a tool that hopefully will feature in your portal, together with FIDH India and SEDA, which is meant to help NGOs and civil society organizations to actually apply the guiding principles to existing cases of business-related human rights abuse, but also in a preventive manner to actually scan businesses' human rights policies. So it's divided in two parts. One is the general human rights check, the other is the real cases of business and human rights abuses. And this is actually meant to be useful in what Guana said in monitoring performance of business in relation to the business respect for human rights. So it's meant as a tool to be able to execute this monitoring task. So I invite NGOs that are interested to come to either Laura or me and ask for a copy. What I wanted to highlight in our efforts to maybe further operationalize the guiding principles and make them more tangible, like what do they really mean in concrete cases? We ran in trouble when in the principles on due diligence, because the due diligence principle is great. It's to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for business-related human rights abuses. And in cases where businesses cause human rights abuses, it's fairly simple what the business should do. They should stop. But in cases where they contribute or are directly linked to human rights abuses, the situation becomes more messy, and it depends upon the specific situation what can actually be expected of a company to do to address their contribution or their link to the human rights abuse. And that's where I actually had expected that during this forum we would be able to build capacity in a multi-stakeholder setting together with business and to governments to actually discuss specific cases and see what can we expect, what is actually needed here to do for companies and for businesses, to do, because this due diligence concept is broadly accepted, but the devil is in the detail. So I think even the opinions will differ among stakeholders, but there's also a lot of capacity needed to be built there. So that was something I just wanted to put on the record also for this forum, for next year in this forum, and also as a call for the working group to look into that. Thank you.
Perez from Improving Work Life.
Hi. Good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to make a comment and also bring on the table and ask a question, because I think we're. I know this session is on capacity building on the implementation of the guiding principles, but I also think that we're taking something for granted, which is actually thinking that workers or people know their rights. I'm a trainer, and I've been in the past, 10 years training basically management on how to implement in practice human rights in their companies, as in how it translates into their policies and their procedures in practice. And I think most of the resources that companies or multi-stakeholder initiatives have have invested in this is to actually train managers, actually to train their compliance people, their CSR people, their auditors, their HR managers. But very few resources are actually spent or invested in training workers on their rights or training people on their rights. And the only way we actually can ensure that they're going to exercise their rights is if they know their rights. And I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with many companies who actually do try greatly to train workers on their rights, but they have 20% turnover, as we were hearing some of the companies in China mentioning. Or the workers don't speak the same language. So they have a lot of challenges on how to actually train them in practice. And we're getting, 500 workers in a room and presenting them with a PowerPoint by a consultant. So none of these types of trainings are actually effective, engaging, fun. I mean, sometimes it's strange to talk about having fun in a training, especially when you're talking about human rights. But unless it's fun and unless it's engaging, these workers are just not going to learn them. It's just not happening. And another thing is that I think traditionally, many businesses have said, no, we're not going to train workers on rights because that's the role of the states, of NGOs, of unions. And actually unions in many occasions get mad when actually companies come in and start training workers. But I think unless we all collectively adopt an active role in training workers, there's not going to be awareness on their rights, and no grievance procedures in place will actually ensure that workers present grievances or that there are remedies in place. So that's just setting it on the table, as in we not only need companies to learn how to implement the principles, but also workers and people to actually know their rights, to be able to exercise their rights we're trying to implement. So I'd also like to hear if you know of initiatives also to share with the rest of the floor of companies or multi-stakeholder initiatives that are bringing forth these type of activities to train workers, or if your organizations are also doing it to encourage further better practices on this issue. Thank you very much.
Scrolling through the list of speakers and ask panelists to comment and respond at the end. I call upon next my friend Mr. Effendi Jamin from the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights.
Thank you, Paul Reichman, for giving me the floor. Now, just a very short comment and question. I think I have to congratulate India to have this CEO Forum on Human Rights. I think that's the first that I've ever heard, in terms of really mainstreaming the business of human rights principles in the business sector. Talking about capacity building, what we have heard from the presenters, of course we know the need from the people, from the community, from the workers, as what has been said earlier, and all the difficulties it has and the challenges on the ground. But one thing that we should not forget, even the government's officials need some capacity building. Because unfortunately, a lot of government officials, I'm talking representing the ASEAN Commission of Human Rights, there is a lack as well of knowledge about their own duty as an officials with respect to regulating business in their own local area. And you have a government structures, something like Brazil and like Indonesia. You have about 492 districts, 32 provinces. So there's a very big challenge in terms of the capacity of these officials with regard to their own duty as a state's officials on human rights. So my question is actually to all panelists: how are you going to face this? To set up to address this challenge that capacity building is not only for the workers, but also among the government officials, and then who are you going to to the same question which was raised by previous speakers. Like they will say, well, this is the responsibility of the state to train. It is those kind of things. But I think with respect to this UNGP framework, what can be then done? Talking about a comprehensive agenda of a capacity building, and what can be done from the regional perspective. Regional perspective in the context of ASEAN, for example. ASEAN has 10 member states, and among these 10 member states, the CSR concept was not even known in 5 member states. So that's just to give an example. That's the how big is the challenge in terms of capacity building. I think I will end up my question. Thank you.
I will call upon Ms. Miriam Montra to answer that question in particular in a few minutes' time, but we might just roll through some other questions first, if I have your permission. Next, the China Labour Watch, Mr. Kevin Slayton.
Thank you. I actually wanted to first emphasize what my colleague before had said about training the workers, or this question of consciousness, rights consciousness. I'm currently at China Labour Watch, but before this, I was at an organization in China called New Urban Home in Qingdao. In Chinese, it's called 新市民之家, and the person who ran that organization is Chen Mingyu, and he was he's the director of the organization. He often told me when we were talking about training workers there, he would always say to me, Kevin, the work we do as an organization is never going to be enough. We're just volunteers and a few people doing some work. In the very end, ultimately, it's going to be the workers themselves who are going to be able to keep this, to sustain the status of their rights, the strength of their rights throughout time. Because we can't be everywhere all the time. None of us can. There's a lot of people in this conference, but we're still very limited in the large scale of things. And the people themselves who are protecting their own rights are always there. By definition, if their rights are being violated, they're always there. And if they know when their rights are being violated and know how to protect them, then that's the most important thing. And so that's the first thing. I wanted to emphasize that. And then going a step beyond, I don't know if this is, when we're talking about comprehensive capacity building, if this is too comprehensive, but can we talk about this education side? I'm not talking about education of workers, but education of children and younger people. Can we talk about getting the GPs into an education system so that no matter where people go, whether they go into the managerial direction or they become a worker themselves, or wherever they go in this model or the system, they are aware of those GPs or of the more practical manifestation of them and know how to protect people's rights and how to rectify problems. So anyway, that bring up the question of, and maybe panelists have some sort of views on bringing education into this. Is this something realistic? Is this something that we can think about in implementation? Thank you.
On Ms. Abigail Price from Hitachi Europe. Ms. Price?
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to ask the panel what, in their opinion, does best practice look like in terms of capacity building within companies? As you know, Hitachi is a huge global organisation, and we're working on an e-learning program which will teach all of our 320,000 employees globally what human rights are, and hopefully what that means to them. But they're not obviously all going to have detailed training on how to do due diligence or impact assessments. So from your knowledge of other companies, who are the really key people or departments that need to have that kind of training?
I might ask Mr. Williams to respond to that specifically in a moment. We have two more speakers on the list, and I might just actually give them the floor before we respond at the level of the panel. try that again. Mr. Tupaj Amaru from the Indian Movement. Oh, yes, please.
Yo soy indígena Quechua.
I am an indigenous person, Quechua, from Bolivia, and I am one of the survivors of the mine exploitation activities in Potosi. We have been following this problem, this theme from a very long time, and we have observed that we cannot resolve it here at the United Nations or in the concerned countries. What is happening? Well, first of all, transnational corporations that are incredibly powerful and financial banks have provoked and are responsible for the environmental crisis, the food crisis, the water crisis, the financial and economic crises. They have generated these crises and they have provoked wars of aggression against neighboring countries. Why have they done this? To be able to take over resources, natural resources that are helping develop northern countries. Now, the task at hand, what we are doing at the moment, of adopting or discussing guiding principles. Well, here I don't see any document. I don't see I don't see any document about these guiding principles here. We have already discussed these guiding principles in the subcommission of the human rights here in the Palais of the United Nations. 5 years ago, it was adopted and it was submitted. The paper was submitted to the Human Rights Council. And then we don't know what has happened with this document. Why should we create a new forum to draft guiding principles if we are going to the same end situation? No, this should not be the case. I want to tell you that this exercise is not going to lead to.
We'll bring your comments to a close. Your 2 minutes has expired, sir, and I would be grateful if you would bring your comments to a close. Thank you. Thank you. The final speaker I call upon is Mr. Abdesadek Atlas from the AIDE Federation. Oh, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry, I've overlooked one more speaker, I'm sorry. Yes, Princess, please. Can I call upon you next? Mr. Abdesadek? Well, might I then, the last speaker I have to call upon is Miss Princess Jennifer Spiff from the Women's Initiative for Transparency and Social Justice, and I apologise for overlooking you earlier in that earlier list. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm coming from Nigeria. We work with global rights on the implementation of voluntary principles in Nigeria. And I want to comment on the first speaker on the agenda of awareness and strategy to work to get government adopt voluntary principle. I would want to add to what he has said so far on the issue of involving indigenous media houses. We need to involve a lot of media houses. They on their own, if we build their capacity, will be able to carry the message to the hinterland and also to the various stakeholders. So we should not exclude the media in our capacity building. I also want to say that even in this forum, I feel to this VP. And the other last one I want to ask is to the lady that talked about capacity building for representative on ICC or something. I would like to know whether you have your representative in Africa, in Nigeria particularly. Now that we want to do awareness workshop for various stakeholders, we can invite them to strengthen what we are doing and also to make sure that we gain credence even before our government and other stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Look, I apologise. Mr. Muriel Olivier from FIDH.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I will speak in French. Je voudrais...
I would like to speak about capacity building of companies by businesses themselves. There are many business fora where discussions are held. There are very high-level discussions held with the CEOs. My question is, what means have they given themselves to deploy in their daily business activities the guiding principles? I would like to speak about three things. The first of all, when we look at transnational companies, when we look at the subsidiaries in Africa and Asia, etc., there is usually no mention of corporate social responsibility or human rights policies. Therefore, what is done at headquarters is not disseminated towards the subsidiaries. Secondly, I would like to know what means are given to managers on a daily basis for their objectives not only to be economic ones, but that the money that is available to them is invested in human rights issues, but also of listening to potential alleged victims and not only used for strictly economic goals. Finally, I would like to know how we can listen to potential victims, whether they be in the neighboring communities or throughout the supply chain. Companies know how to do this. A company produces goods or services and they market these goods and services. And to do this, they need to listen to clients and consumers. Nobody can tell me that a business cannot listen to potential victims or affected victims affected by abuses. To end, I would like to say that we need to put human rights at the heart of business activities, and this does not mean only having corporate speeches. We need to listen, we need to be present worldwide, and we need to work with the affected, concerned people. So we need to rethink governance in businesses and ensure that economic governments integrate human rights rather than human rights just being the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you for all those comments and questions. I think in the questions boil down of those contributions boil down to two sets of questions. One set to Miriam Montra about from Rafendi Jamin's question about addressing how to address the competence of training, capacity building amongst governments, and the question posed by Princess in relation to Africa. If you would address that, and Mr. Williams, if I might call upon you to address the question from Ms. Price about the what does capacity building mean within work, how does it work within companies, and I think also Princess Biff's question also. And for the other two panellists, if you might take the opportunity to reflect at the end of those responses to questions, and we may need to do that very, very promptly.
Thank you, Professor Redmond. With respect to the training of government officials, I couldn't agree more with you. I think this is important, especially given that we now have, very clear guiding principles and that there is a need to disseminate them. If I take the example of the Canadian government, for instance, what we've been doing as a national human rights institutions is actually linking with the departments that do have a role to play in implementing the guidelines. So, for instance, our Department of Foreign Affairs, there's lots of things that they're doing around the extractive industry, and then we've been linking with them in terms of the roles that we can play to assist them, but also getting them to understand those guiding principles better. And also in terms of the work that they're doing around the OECD as well. The other way we're doing that as well is linking with CASHRA, which is the organization that is encompassing all the national human rights institutions at the provincial level in Canada, and also trying to get them to better understand the guiding principles so that they can in turn talk to their local governments about what needs to be done, and then having some impact around businesses, be it at the provincial, territorial, or the federal level. Just quickly on the training portion, there were two parts to the training. One was about workers themselves, and there was one that was beyond the workers. We're talking about schools. With respect to the workers, if again I take like the work that we've been doing at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, I've mentioned the maturity model for human rights that we have developed. In developing that particular model, we've integrated the concept of the guiding principles, but we also made sure that at the table, while we were developing our tool, that we had not only representatives from both the private sector, business sector, public sector, the government, but also employee representatives and unions, so that they could fully be part of the process, and then in turn be able to talk to their constituency within the companies, so that again people are well aware of their rights. Now granted that people get afraid because they're thinking that if you tell workers too much about their rights, then the complaints will rise. And we're saying, well, this is fine. I work in prevention all the time, and what I'm saying is that the more people are aware, the more you can see that, they're coming forward with issues that you have to deal with. And this is also very healthy in terms of advancing the work that we are trying to achieve. I totally agree that we need to start with children in the schools. And one of the things that we've been doing as well is reaching out to organizations that have that ability, because at the provincial level, this responsibility falls within the provinces and territories in Canada, not at the federal level. But again, we can link through our Association of National Human Rights Institutions, so that they can in turn look at having more of those principles taught and part of curriculums in schools and universities. That's very important as well. The last thing I want to mention is in reply to what Olivier was mentioning. On parlait de ce qu'on pouvait faire.
We were speaking about what we can do in terms of managers. Well, perhaps the obligations that are linked to the guiding principles should be part of the responsibility that they have, and this should be linked to the bonus that they receive at the end of the year. Because when there is money at stake, then people react a lot faster.
Thank you. We need to finish in 3 minutes, so if I might ask Mr. Williams to respond to those two questions.
The first question, of course, by a colleague from Hitachi. I'm glad that you've done so much of work towards the training and reaching out to your entire workforce. But I think you're being a little selfish. Why only to your workforce? Why don't you put it on the website and let it be available to many other companies? If possible, try and do that. And I think, training in business houses is taken care of by the HR department. You asked about which departments really are engaged in. So HR department, and they would take the lead, whether it's to do with 1 or 2 or 3 other departments, but they would be the principal leaders to take this forward. So I'll request you, put it on our website. It'll help many other companies. The second point is about Nigeria. Princess, you mentioned about Nigeria. You're most welcome to have a communication with us, and then we will see as to how we can engage. And we were there in Kenya last month. And I was very happy to actually, when we had the GBI meeting there in Nairobi, that Kenya government also wants to start up a CEO forum in Kenya. So it's very good. It's something which will, I think, pick up, and I'm glad that you're interested in it. We'll share our good practices, and then we'll leave it to you how you take it forward. Thank you.
To answer you as well, as part of our working group on business and human rights in the context of ICC, we have representatives from each of the regions, and we have 2 representatives from Africa, namely currently the 2 that have been named by the Association of NHRIs in Africa are Malawi, and the second one is Ghana. There's always opportunities for us to be able to come and assist with any of those forums and disseminations and training that you would like to do. So it's just a matter of getting in touch with us, and then we'll make sure that something can be done in that regard.
Thank you. Mansak, do you wish to add anything?
Yes. Let me, since there's no time, I don't want to answer the question, but I just want to say my final remark. I think that to make the guiding principle operational and useful, unless not only the people in this forum, but we need to have the people of the whole to have a basic knowledge on a guiding principle, and then this guiding principle will be useful for us. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Lana, the last word.
No. last word. Just answering Hitachi, I wanted to touch upon that. I think the problem we have seen with training in companies is that you start with the Universal Declaration and it becomes very abstract. I think the point is you will have to watch what are your risks. I imagine Hitachi has problem with worker rights, things regarding extraction of minerals, consumers' rights. So any human rights training should be oriented to your risk and your problems, the areas in which you have been accused of human rights violations. It's not an abstract thing. It's very concrete. And it has to include what to do if a worker knows about something, how it can make that information change the policy of the company. Thank you.
Friends, panelists, thank you very much for your contributions. Friends, thank you very much for your contributions. I've been asked to close the session and also to ask you to be up in room 20, one level up the main room at 3:30 sharp. So thank you all again very much, and I thank my colleagues on the panel.